ChessDiagnostic.
Hello everybody and welcome to ChessDiagnostic. Today we're going to look at a game between Magnus Carlsen and Julio, Ernesto, Granda, Zuniga. Now this was played in 2006, and the reason I'm covering this game, and I've been wanting to do this video for a while, is because I'm going to go through my thought process for positional plans in the middle game between my own thinking and Magnus Carlsen's. Now, it's really been on my mind a lot, the difference between how I'm thinking and how international masters and grandmasters are thinking. So I've learned the basics of activity and how to form a plan, but I haven't really achieved the subtle positional understanding that I would like. And it's been frustrating, but I've had a few realizations that I want to share. And the first is that when you analyze a game, you're really looking into the stronger player's mind. Now, there's an algorithm that works in chess, and it might sound basic, but I'm going to oversimplify it. But it goes thinking first, and then the move. And I know it sounds really basic, but a lot of players, myself included, have followed learning moves from openings or tactics and not really examining the thinking behind it, which is the most important thing. So let's start with this game and we'll go into what I'm talking about. Magnus Carlsen starts with e4, c5, knight to f3, d6. So we get the Sicilian with d4, c takes d, knight takes. Now knight to f6, hitting the e4 pawn, knight to c3. a6 going into the Najdorf variation, and then bishop to e3. So I've played these moves a lot, the English attack. A lot of people know these moves, even 1200 players. So what's the difference between playing these moves and then being able to play like a grandmaster? So we'll see here. And I'm going to talk about the plan that I go into because I did a guess the move type training here. So we get e5, the knight back to b3, it could go to f3, but either way, all these moves are okay. And I know this line, after bishop to e7, bishop to e2, castle, castle. So black plays knight from b to d7. And this is where I stopped and tried to form a plan and figure out what Magnus Carlsen would do. And he actually plays it brilliantly. But I want to make a point that when somebody like Magnus Carlsen or a 2700 grandmaster is playing a move, it actually seems simple to them. And it is simple to them. Their thought process, their thinking is overall simple. So why is it so hard to play at that level? Why do only 10 or 20 players play at that level? The reason is the clarity of thinking is incredibly difficult to achieve because it takes getting rid of all the fat from how you think about a position. But it's also a definite hard skill in planning how you're going to play in a position. And we'll see this here. So I'm going to start with how I plan this position. And I've played this position, this opening, in at least 100 games, blitz, and I've played over the board a few times. Alright, so my plan normally centers around playing f3 to protect the e4 pawn, playing queen to d2, connecting the rooks. Now I talk about this all the time. So this is where the subtleness is sometimes missed by me and other players. So those moves definitely aren't losing. They're good. They're not bad moves. But what Magnus Carlsen does is so different from what I thought of. I didn't even think of his plan. And I'll go into why it seems very subtle, but also very logical. Anyway, so back to my plan. I play queen to d2, connect the rooks. So it will look like this. I play f3, queen to d2, bring a rook over, either the f, probably the f rook. Try to pile on pressure on this weak backward d6 pawn by playing bishop to g5, and then maybe an idea eventually like a4. So what's wrong with that plan? Well, there's nothing wrong with it, and that's the problem. It's hard to figure out why this plan is better. But we'll see what Magnus Carlsen does and why it's so clearly better. So if I play f3 right now, what would black do? And actually, if you want to pause the video and try to come up with your own plan. So what would black do? And I thought about this, and I realized Magnus Carlsen and other very strong grandmasters, they start their plan with what their opponent's going to do. And then they work backwards and figure out, if my opponent's going to do this, how can I prevent it, and where should my pieces be? So these questions are really important. And that's been the missing component for my own plans. I figure out how I can attack the opponent, how I can get my pieces active, but I'm not really going deep into the opponent's side. And in my own thinking, this has been a huge mistake, and we'll see what Magnus Carlsen does now, okay? So if I played f3, so Magnus Carlsen played a4. Now why is a4 so strong? Well, if I just think of my own plans of f3, bringing the queen up, connecting the rooks, the problem with that is that I didn't come into what black would do. So f3 comes into knight to b6. Now b5 is another option as well, and for black, with b5, it doesn't really, or I guess I could say after f3, it doesn't really stop any of black's plans. He can just go about with normal development, increasing his activity while I do the same. Now that's normal, but a much better idea is to increase your activity while making sure the opponent doesn't have any options. Now it's the same thing. So with f3, we get knight to b6, and then immediately, for example, if I play queen to d2, black can play d5 immediately, releasing all of his problems and getting an easy game. So, understanding this idea, we come to a4. Now this is what Magnus Carlsen played. Now if black plays knight to b6, we just play a5, reducing all of his activity and forcing a move back. So that's the first part of his plan, reducing black's activity. And now he can't play b5, releasing his position. He has to play b6, somewhat passive, and now we can resume with f3. So after bishop to b7, this is where things get interesting. Magnus Carlsen's skill at planning his position is not centered around a tactical motif, an opening line, or anything. It's really asking these questions and developing the thought process. So what would you do in this position? Would you play queen to d2, bring a rook over, pile on? It's a logical plan, but it's not the best. What Magnus Carlsen comes up with here is rook to f2. Now this really solves all of white's problems in terms of awkward piece placement and restricts black to the maximum. So once Magnus Carlsen came up with this plan, all the moves follow easily. Where would you want this knight? This knight is as good as it's gonna get. Okay, so the knight wants to go to d5. It has a lock on the d5 square. Now this knight is otherwise pretty passive. He can't play b5 because he'd lose a pawn, but the rook on here is quite active. If he plays b5, we can even play something like a5 eventually. This bishop is good, and this bishop is a little awkwardly placed because it doesn't really have anywhere to go, as well as this rook. So these are the two most inactive pieces. And he solves that by playing rook to f2. So what about this knight? Where would you want this knight? You could play knight to d2 and then knight to f4, but it's a little more vulnerable along the c file. The rook can attack it. He could eventually play b5 because the knight on c4 would be blocking the bishop. So Magnus Carlsen comes up with the plan of swinging the rook over and bringing his knight to b4. And now we'd have two knights controlling the d5 square. So if you understand this plan, all the moves follow quickly and naturally. Rook to f2, queen to c7, bishop to f1, getting out of the way of the rook. And notice that this bishop on the initial square is actually incredibly active. And that's a unique property of bishops, is that even if it's all the way back on the initial square, it can be controlling the entire diagonal. And now notice black really has nothing to do. Magnus starts with his knight rerouting, and all these moves flow very quickly. Rook to d2. Alright, so he's followed his positional plan very clearly and accurately. It looks like we could take this pawn or win a pawn, but actually not, because after d5, again, black is threatening to activate all his pieces and solve all of his problems. So Magnus Carlsen doesn't allow that. He simply follows his plan, knight to b4. Now, the real genius of bringing the knight to b4 is not just that it controls the d5 square, but it can also induce mistakes. And at their level, the grandmaster level, it's really necessary to not just play strong moves, but to also induce mistakes from the opponent. So what's the mistake here? Well, it's very tempting, and not so obvious why you can't do it, to play a5. So a5 chases the knight back, but the long-term issue is that after a5, black has created two huge holes on the queen side and in the center. Alright, so you can see that the moves of black have not really accomplished anything. He has no plan, while Magnus Carlsen has followed a very clear plan. And now we get a5, a mistake. Moving back, now it looked like he could have taken again here, but we still get the same issue of black releasing himself. Alright, so with the knight moving back, we can see that Magnus Carlsen has completely tied up his opponent, and now he owns the b5 square as well as the d5 square and putting pressure on this weak d6 pawn. Black has had absolutely no counterplay, and he's completely passive. And now after a blunder here, moving the knight back, we get knight to b5, the queen moves back, Magnus Carlsen has won a pawn, and actually his opponent resigned at this point because it would have been clearly winning for Magnus, and there's just nothing that black can do at this point. A little earlier, he could have played something like h6, and then we would have really gotten a positional masterclass, because after something like, well, here, let's go back. So after something like h6, we'd still get knight to b5, something like queen to c6, c4, completely tying up black. And now if knight to d7, we get something like g3. So this is just an example line that the computer is recommending. And you can see that with all these moves, we'll get to an end position. Now this is the strongest lines, or one of the strongest lines that the computer recommends. And at the end of this line, black has a completely inactive bishop. He's a pawn down, so he has a bad bishop, some weak pawns, and white would eventually break through, and he has a protected pass pawn. and that's with the strongest computer line. So at the end of all of Magnus Carlsen's plans, if we go back, he's won a pawn with an absolutely dominating position, and he didn't move this rook once. This bishop is on its initial square. This bishop stayed here, and the rook and the queen battery is just too strong. So really, he didn't win this game by any tactical blow, by any really complicated opening line. He won this game simply by understanding the nature of the position. Of course, easier said than done, but I really wanted to make this video just to try to make a point about the thought process and understanding the thematic ideas behind these kind of games, because I think that's missed in a lot of analysis and trying to really get to the heart of it, because if you don't know what you don't know, you're not going to find it. Alright, so I hope this was helpful. I hope to make more videos like this, analyzing the thinking really in these master games, not just the moves, not just the what happened in a tactical blow, but how did it get there? Magnus Carlsen beat a 2600 grandmaster by doing what appears to be nothing special, but the thematic thinking originating from this point with rook to f2 is really what won him this game. Alright, so I hope this was helpful. If you enjoyed this video, please comment or like it, and I'll see you in the future. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for future videos. See you in the future.